The gavel echoed through the marble halls of the Phoenix Federal Courthouse like a gunshot. I sat alone on the cold wooden bench outside Courtroom 4B, watching my family's attorney stride past me without so much as a glance. 15 years. 15 years since I'd last spoken to any of them, and this is how we meet again, fighting over money, over land, over a legacy I never wanted, but apparently never deserved either. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the simple black blazer I'd bought specifically for today. Nothing fancy, nothing that screamed federal agent, just clean lines and quiet dignity. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent the last decade and a half hunting down the most dangerous criminals along the Mexican border, facing down cartel members who wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in my head. Yet sitting outside this courtroom waiting to face my own family felt like walking into a minefield blindfolded. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and there they were. My parents, Frank and Linda Martinez, walking arm in arm like they were attending some social event, rather than a legal proceeding designed to strip me of any connection to the family I'd once loved more than my own life. Dad's silver hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit tailored to hide the slight paunch that good living and comfortable retirement had given him. Mom clutched her designer purse like a shield, her coral lipstick freshly applied, her eyes scanning the hallway for potential witnesses to whatever performance she was about to give. Behind them came David, my younger brother, the golden child who could do no wrong even when everything he touched seemed to crumble. He'd inherited Dad's broad shoulders and Mom's sharp jawline, but there was something softer about him, something that had always made people want to protect him, to give him chances he probably didn't deserve. His wife Ashley followed close behind, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, and a sympathetic expression that didn't quite reach her calculating blue eyes. Even their kids, Tyler and Emma, had been dressed up for the occasion, looking confused and uncomfortable as they were herded along like props in some elaborate stage production. None of them looked at me. Not one glance, not even the brief acknowledgement you'd give a stranger sharing the same waiting area. I might as well have been invisible, which was exactly how they'd always preferred it. The family attorney, Richard Thornton, emerged from the courtroom looking satisfied in that particular way lawyers get when they believe they're about to demolish someone's life for a substantial fee. He was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-40s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. His briefcase looked expensive, his shoes gleamed, and when he spoke to my family in hushed tones, I caught fragments of phrases like clear abandonment, and irresponsible choices, and, quote, complete severance of family ties. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old text messages, not really reading them, just needing something to do with my hands. 3 years ago, when Grandpa Joe passed away, I'd gotten exactly one notification about his death, a brief, formal message from the family attorney informing me that services would be private and my presence was not requested. No call from Mom, no text from David, just legal paperwork delivered like an eviction notice. What they didn't know, what none of them could have suspected, was that I'd been there anyway. I'd stood at the back of Sacred Heart Cemetery in Scottsdale, hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees, watching from a distance as they lowered the only person who'd ever truly understood me into the desert ground. Grandpa Joe had been the one who taught me to ride, who showed me how to fix a broken fence post, who listened to my dreams of seeing the world beyond the dusty confines of our small ranch. He'd been the one who'd quietly slipped me his business card for a family friend at the FBI recruitment office when I'd told him I wanted to make a difference in the world. He'd also been the one who'd looked me in the eye the last time I'd seen him alive and said, "Rebecca, sometimes doing the right thing costs everything you thought you wanted, but it's the only way you can live with yourself afterward." I hadn't understood what he meant then. I'd been 25, fresh out of the DEA academy, full of righteous anger and absolute certainty about the difference between good and evil. I thought family loyalty meant keeping secrets, even when those secrets involved federal crimes. I thought love meant looking the other way when the people you cared about made choices that violated everything you'd sworn to uphold. I'd learned better the hard way. The courtroom doors opened again, and the bailiff, a tired-looking man named Officer Rodriguez, called out, "Martinez family estate hearing, Judge Wells presiding." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many families tear themselves apart over money, who'd watched love dissolve into litigation more times than he cared to count. My family filed in first, a united front of perfectly coordinated outfits and shared righteousness. They took their seats on the plaintiff's side like they owned the place. Which, given the circumstances, they probably thought they did. David helped settle the kids, while Ashley arranged papers with the focused intensity of someone who'd clearly done her homework on every aspect of this case. I waited until they were seated before standing slowly, my knee protesting slightly from an old injury sustained during a raid in Juarez 2 years earlier. The scar was hidden beneath my slacks, but the ache remained, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to not making it home that night. As I walked toward the defendant's table, I could feel their eyes on me for the first time in 15 years. But it wasn't the kind of attention I'd once craved. It was assessment, calculation, the cold evaluation of an opponent, rather than the warm recognition of family. I sat down alone at the defendant's table, opened my simple folder of documents, and waited for Judge Wells to enter. Somewhere in this room, my family was about to discover that the daughter they'd written off, the sister they'd erased, the woman they'd convinced themselves was a failure and a disappointment, had been living a life they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. But that revelation was still coming. For now, I just sat quietly, hands folded, and prepared to watch them try to take away the last thing connecting me to the man who'd believed in me when no one else would. Judge Patricia Wells entered with the measured stride of someone who'd presided over countless family disputes, her black robes flowing behind her like a cape of authority. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the courtroom in a single sweep. When she settled into her chair and adjusted her reading glasses, the room fell into the kind of silence that only federal courtrooms can command. This is the matter of Martinez versus Martinez, case number 2024 CV 8847, regarding the estate of Joseph Antonio Martinez, deceased. Her voice carried clearly through the room, each word precise and unforgiving. "Counsel for the plaintiffs, please state your case." Richard Thornton rose with the fluid confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment extensively. His expensive suit caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, and when he smiled at Judge Wells, it was the practiced expression of a man who believed charm could substitute for substance. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of abandonment and forfeiture. The defendant, Rebecca Martinez, voluntarily severed all ties with her family over 15 years ago, choosing to pursue a lifestyle fundamentally incompatible with family values and responsibilities." I kept my expression neutral, but inside, something twisted. Lifestyle incompatible with family values. If only he knew what those family values actually entailed. Thornton continued, his voice gaining momentum like an actor hitting his stride. The deceased, Joseph Martinez, was a man of traditional beliefs who valued family loyalty above all else. When his granddaughter chose to abandon her family obligations, to turn her back on the business and land that had supported the Martinez family for 3 generations, she forfeited any claim to his estate. The will in question was written during a period of diminished capacity, influenced by medications and the emotional distress of dealing with a granddaughter who had become, for all practical purposes, a stranger. I watched David's face during this recitation. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when Thornton mentioned family loyalty. He knew better than anyone what kind of loyalty our family had demanded, and what had happened when I'd refused to provide it. Furthermore, Thornton continued, warming to his theme, the defendant has made no attempt to maintain contact with the family during the deceased's final years. She did not attend family gatherings, did not contribute to his care during his illness, and did not even attend his funeral. This is not the behavior of someone who deserves to inherit property and assets that could benefit family members who actually remained committed to family bonds. Judge Wells listened without expression, occasionally making notes on the legal pad in front of her. When Thornton finished his opening statement, she turned to me with the same neutral professionalism she'd shown him. Miss Martinez, do you have representation, or will you be proceeding pro se? I stood slowly, feeling the weight of my family's collective gaze. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. Very well. Please state your response to the plaintiff's claims. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I'd practiced this speech in my apartment mirror dozens of times, but standing here with my family's hostile attention focused on me felt entirely different. Your Honor, I respectfully disagree with opposing counsel's characterization of the circumstances surrounding my relationship with my family and my grandfather. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, carrying the authority I'd learned during years of testifying in federal cases. The will in question was written by Joseph Martinez in sound mind and with full legal capacity, as verified by multiple medical examinations conducted at his request specifically to prevent the kind of challenge we're seeing today. My grandfather was not a man who made decisions lightly, and he understood exactly what he was doing when he made his final wishes known. I paused, letting that sink in before continuing. As for the allegations of abandonment, I would argue that the circumstances of my departure from the family were far more complex than plaintiff's counsel suggests. Sometimes, Your Honor, family loyalty and moral obligation come into direct conflict, and when that happens, a person must choose between protecting family secrets and upholding the law. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees. David's face had gone pale, and I saw Mom's hand tighten on Dad's arm. They knew exactly what I was referring to, even if Thornton didn't yet understand the implications. I did not abandon my family lightly or carelessly, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I made a choice to prioritize my professional obligations and personal integrity over family pressure to ignore criminal activity. That choice cost me dearly, but it was the right choice then, and it remains the right choice now. Judge Wells leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. Ms. Martinez, are you alleging that your departure from the family was related to criminal conduct? Before I could answer, Thornton shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is making unsubstantiated allegations that have no bearing on. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The validity of the will in question. Overruled, Judge Wells said firmly. Given that the plaintiff has made the defendant's character and family loyalty central to their case, the circumstances of that departure are directly relevant. Please continue, Ms. Martinez. I took a deep breath, feeling 15 years of silence about to break open like a dam under pressure. Your Honor, in 2009, while employed as a federal agent, I discovered evidence that Martinez Construction Company was being used to launder money for Mexican drug cartels. When I attempted to discuss this discovery with my family, I was told in no uncertain terms that family loyalty required me to ignore what I'd learned. When I refused to compromise my professional obligations and personal ethics, I was effectively banished from the family. The courtroom erupted. David jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. That's a lie. She's making things up to justify running away. Mr. Martinez, sit down, Judge Wells commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Any further outbursts will result in your removal from this courtroom. Dad sat like a statue, his face completely expressionless, but I could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the telltale sign of stress I remembered from childhood. Mom had gone white as paper, her carefully applied makeup suddenly garish against her pale skin. Even Ashley looked shaken, probably realizing for the first time that the family she'd married into might be more complicated than she'd imagined. Thornton was frantically whispering with my family, clearly trying to decide whether to double down on his original strategy or pivot to damage control. I remained standing, my hands steady on the table in front of me, waiting for the judge to restore order. Ms. Martinez, Judge Wells said once the room had settled, these are serious allegations. Do you have documentation to support these claims? I do, Your Honor. I reached into my folder and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I have copies of the original investigative files, financial records showing suspicious cash transactions, and correspondence between myself and various federal agencies regarding the Martinez Construction Company investigation. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear my family's collective intake of breath, the moment when they realized that their carefully constructed narrative about the wayward daughter was about to crumble. Thornton recovered first, his lawyer instincts kicking in despite the obvious shock. "Your Honor, even if these allegations are true, they don't change the fundamental issue before the court. The defendant still chose to leave the family rather than work through these alleged problems internally." I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. Work through these problems internally. As if there was some family therapy approach to money laundering for drug cartels. "Mr. Thornton," I said, turning to face him directly, "what exactly would you have suggested I do? Ignore federal crimes? Compromise ongoing investigations? Violate my oath as a federal agent? Because those were my options 15 years ago, and I chose the only path consistent with my professional and moral obligations." Judge Wells was studying the documents I'd provided, her expression growing more serious with each page. "Ms. Martinez, according to these files, the investigation into Martinez Construction Company resulted in multiple federal indictments." "Yes, Your Honor." "Though the company itself was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing after implementing extensive compliance measures and cooperating fully with federal authorities." I glanced at my father, whose expression remained carefully neutral. "My family was never charged with any crimes, and the investigation concluded that they were likely unaware of how their company was being used." That was the official version anyway. The truth was more complicated, involving plea agreements and sealed records, and the kind of legal maneuvering that allowed prominent local families to avoid public scandal while still ensuring that justice was served. But even that heavily sanitized version of events was enough to fundamentally alter the dynamic in this courtroom. David had slumped in his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him as the reality of the situation became clear. Mom was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, though whether from genuine emotion or calculated performance was impossible to tell. Dad continued to stare straight ahead, his businessman's poker face firmly in place. "Your Honor," Thornton said, clearly struggling to salvage his case. "Regardless of these allegations, the fact remains that the defendant chose to prioritize her career over her family relationships. Even if her motivations were pure, the result was the same abandonment we've alleged." "Mr. Thornton," Judge Wells replied dryly, "are you seriously arguing that a federal agent should have covered up potential criminal activity to preserve family harmony?" The question hung in the air like smoke, exposing the fundamental weakness in their entire case. They had built their argument on the assumption that family loyalty should trump everything else, including professional ethics and legal obligations. But in a federal courtroom, presided over by a federal judge, that argument suddenly sounded not just weak, but almost offensive. I sat back down, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. For 15 years, I'd carried the weight of my family's version of events, the story they'd told themselves and everyone else about the ungrateful daughter who'd turned her back on everything they'd given her. But sitting here now, watching Thornton fumble for a response that didn't exist, I realized that their version had always been built on a foundation of lies and self-deception. The truth was finally coming out, and it was nothing like the story they'd been telling. Judge Wells called for a brief recess, and as the courtroom slowly emptied, I found myself alone with memories I'd spent years trying to bury. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the polished wood floors, and in those shadows, I could see myself at 7 years old, standing in the doorway of Dad's office at the construction company, watching him count stacks of cash that seemed impossibly large to my child's eyes. I hadn't understood then what I was seeing. All I knew was that Dad always seemed happier on the days when the men with the accents came to visit, when they spoke in rapid Spanish and left with handshakes and promises. Mom would make her special enchiladas on those nights, and the whole house would smell like cumin and celebration. David would get new toys, I'd get new books, and for a few precious days, our family would feel like the happy, successful Martinez clan that everyone in Scottsdale thought we were. The first crack in that perfect facade came when I was 12. I'd been homesick from school with strep throat, camped out on the living room couch with a stack of library books and a bottle of cherry cough syrup that made everything taste like artificial happiness. Mom was in the kitchen, talking on the phone in the hushed tones she used for important conversations, but the house was small enough that her voice carried. "Frank, I don't care what Miguel says about the timeline. Rebecca's getting old enough to ask questions, and David's already repeating things he hears at the office. We can't keep this up forever." I'd pressed my ear against the couch cushions, straining to hear Dad's side of the conversation, but Mom's responses told me everything I needed to know. "I know the money's good. I know it's keeping us afloat. But what happens when the kids figure out where it's really coming from? What happens when Rebecca starts asking why we have more money than any other construction company in Arizona?" There was a long pause, and when Mom spoke again, her voice was sharp with frustration. "Don't you dare tell me I'm being paranoid. That girl notices everything, Frank. Everything. Yesterday, she asked me why the men who come to your office never want receipts for their payments. She's 12 years old, and she's already connecting dots we don't want her to connect." I'd pretended to be asleep when Mom came to check on me, but inside, my mind was racing. The men who came to Dad's office, the ones who spoke Spanish and carried briefcases full of cash, they weren't paying for construction work. They were paying for something else, something that made Mom nervous and Dad defensive. But I was 12, and 12-year-olds don't investigate their parents' business dealings. They find ways to rationalize what they've heard, to convince themselves that grown-ups know what they're doing, and that families like ours don't get involved in anything truly dangerous. I told myself that Mom was just being overcautious, that Dad's success was the result of hard work and smart business decisions. That delusion lasted until I was 16 and working summers at the construction company, filing paperwork and learning the business that was supposed to be my inheritance. It was supposed to be David's too, but David had never shown much interest in the day-to-day operations. He was more interested in the lifestyle the business provided, the nice cars and expensive vacations, the status that came with being Frank Martinez's son. I, on the other hand, was fascinated by the mechanics of running a company. I wanted to understand every aspect of the operation, from bidding on contracts to managing payroll to tracking expenses. Dad seemed pleased by my interest, at least at first. He'd bring me to job sites, introduce me to foremen and subcontractors, explain the complexities of commercial construction projects. But there were always certain files I wasn't allowed to see, certain meetings I wasn't allowed to attend, certain clients whose names were never mentioned in my presence. When I asked about these restrictions, Dad would ruffle my hair and tell me I was too young to worry about the boring administrative stuff. "Focus on learning the real business, Nija," he'd say. "The construction part. The rest is just paperwork." But I was my grandfather's granddaughter, and Grandpa Joe had taught me that paperwork was never just paperwork. Numbers told stories, and if you knew how to read them, they could tell you everything you needed to know about a person or a business. So I started reading the numbers. It began innocently enough. I'd stay late at the office, supposedly organizing files and updating inventory lists, but really studying the patterns in our financial records. Why did we have so many cash transactions? Why were certain projects consistently over budget while others came in exactly on estimate? Why did we have clients who paid in full before work even began, when industry standard was to collect payment in stages? The answers, when they finally came together in my 17-year-old mind, were terrifying. Martinez Construction Company wasn't just building strip malls and office complexes. We were laundering money for people who moved drugs across the border, providing a legitimate business front for transactions that couldn't be conducted through normal banking channels. The men with the accents weren't paying for construction services. They were paying us to clean their money, to make it look like legitimate business income. And my father, the man I'd idolized since childhood, was not just aware of this arrangement. He was orchestrating it. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I remember sitting in Dad's office at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, staring at a spreadsheet that proved beyond doubt what our family business really was, and feeling my entire world collapse. This wasn't some minor tax evasion or casual corner cutting. This was serious federal crime, the kind that put people in prison for decades. I spent that whole night walking around Scottsdale, trying to figure out what to do with what I'd learned. Part of me wanted to confront Dad directly, to demand explanations and assurances that we could find a way out of whatever arrangement we'd gotten into. But another part of me, the part that had been listening to law enforcement recruiting presentations at school, knew that this wasn't the kind of problem you solved with family meetings. When I finally went home the next morning, exhausted and confused, I found Mom making breakfast with the same cheerful efficiency she'd always shown. David was at the kitchen table, complaining about his chemistry teacher and planning his weekend. Dad was reading the newspaper, occasionally commenting on local politics or business news. They all looked so normal, so innocent, so completely unaware that their comfortable life was built on a foundation of federal crimes. And in that moment, I realized that they weren't unaware at all. They knew exactly what was happening, and they'd made a collective decision to pretend otherwise. "Rebecca, honey, you look terrible," Mom said, studying my face with maternal concern. "Did you sleep at all last night?" "I stayed late at the office," I said carefully, working on some filing projects for Dad. Dad looked up from his newspaper, his expression unreadable. "Find everything you needed?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. He knew what I'd been looking at. He knew what I'd figured out. And he was giving me a choice. Pretend I'd never seen those numbers, or face the consequences of knowing too much. "I found exactly what I was looking for," I replied, meeting his gaze directly. We stared at each other across the kitchen table, father and daughter, co-conspirators or potential enemies, while Mom continued making pancakes and David remained obliviously focused on his teenage problems. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with unspoken threats and impossible choices. Finally, Dad folded his newspaper and stood up. "Rebecca, why don't you come to the office with me today? I think it's time we had a more detailed conversation about the family business." That conversation changed everything. Dad didn't deny what I'd discovered. Instead, he explained it with the calm pragmatism of a businessman discussing market conditions. "The drug money was a temporary arrangement," he said, "something to help us weather the economic downturn that had devastated the construction industry. We weren't hurting anyone, weren't dealing drugs ourselves, just providing a service that certain people needed." "Everyone benefits," he said, leaning back in his leather office chair. "They get clean money, we get enough cash flow to keep our legitimate projects running, and nobody gets hurt." "What about the law?" I asked. "What about the fact that this is completely illegal?" Dad's expression hardened. "The law, Mija, is written by people who've never had to make payroll during a recession. The law doesn't care if honest contractors go out of business, because they can't compete with companies that cut corners and exploit workers. Sometimes you have to choose between following the rules and surviving." But I wasn't buying it. Even at 17, I understood that survival didn't justify everything, that there were lines you didn't cross regardless of the consequences. And more importantly, I understood that the money wasn't temporary, and the arrangement wasn't harmless. "Dad, this isn't just about us anymore," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The people you're working with, they're not just businessmen who need banking services. They're part of organizations that destroy communities, that kill people, that poison everything they touch." "That's not our problem," Dad replied firmly. "We provide a service. What our clients do with their money after it's clean is not our responsibility." But it was our responsibility, and we both knew it. Every dollar we laundered helped fund operations that brought drugs into American communities, that corrupted law enforcement, that turned the border region into a war zone. We weren't innocent contractors caught up in something beyond our control. We were active participants in a criminal enterprise. The conversation ended with Dad making his position clear. I could accept the family business as it was, or I could find somewhere else to spend my summers. There was no middle ground, no room for moral objections, no possibility of gradually transitioning to legitimate operations. I chose to find somewhere else to spend my summers, but the damage to our relationship was permanent. From that day forward, I was no longer Dad's eager apprentice or Mom's cooperative daughter. I was a potential threat, someone who knew too much and couldn't be trusted to keep quiet. Family dinners became exercises in careful conversation, avoiding topics that might lead to uncomfortable revelations. Family gatherings felt like elaborate performances, everyone playing their assigned roles while pretending not to notice the massive secret sitting in the center of the room. David remained blissfully unaware of the tension, or at least he pretended to be. He continued to enjoy the benefits of Dad's business success, without asking inconvenient questions about its source. Mom continued to manage the household and maintain the family's social standing, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. And I continued to live in a house where I was simultaneously a beloved daughter and a dangerous liability, cherished and mistrusted in equal measure. The pattern became clear during my senior year of high school. Every achievement I earned, every honor I received, was met with a strange mixture of pride and anxiety from my parents. When I was accepted to Arizona State University with a partial scholarship, Mom cried with joy, but I caught her whispering to Dad later that night about whether college would make me ask more questions. When I announced my intention to major in criminal justice, the temperature in the room dropped so noticeably that even David looked up from his video game. "Criminal justice?" Dad repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "That's an interesting choice, Mija. What made you decide on that field?" I could have lied. I could have said something about wanting to help people or being fascinated by legal procedures. Instead, I looked him directly in the eye and said, "I want to understand how the system works, how justice actually gets served." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom busied herself clearing dinner plates that were still half full. David suddenly found his homework urgently important. Dad nodded slowly, as if he was working through complex calculations in his head. "Well," he said finally, "it's good to have goals." But his tone suggested it was anything but good, at least from his perspective. College became my escape hatch. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who didn't know about the family business, who saw me as just another student trying to figure out her place in the world. I threw myself into my studies with the intensity of someone who'd finally found her calling. Constitutional law, criminal procedure, federal investigations, forensic accounting, every class felt like a piece of armor I was building around myself. My professors noticed my dedication. Dr. Sarah Whitman, who taught a seminar on white-collar crime, pulled me aside after class one day during my junior year. She was a former federal prosecutor who'd left government service to teach, and she had the sharp, analytical mind of someone who'd spent years putting together complex criminal cases. "Rebecca, your work this semester has been exceptional," she said, settling into the chair behind her desk. "Have you given any thought to what you want to do after graduation?" "I'm thinking about law school," I replied, which was only half true. I was actually thinking about law enforcement, but I hadn't figured out how to explain that to my family. "You should consider federal service," Dr. Whitman said. "The FBI, the DEA, the Treasury Department, they're always looking for people with your analytical skills and academic background. The work can be challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding." She handed me a business card for a contact at the DEA recruiting office. "If you're interested, give Special Agent Martinez a call. Tell her I recommended you." The irony of the name wasn't lost on me. Here I was, Rebecca Martinez, being recruited to join an agency that investigated exactly the kind of crimes my family was committing. It felt like destiny, or maybe just cosmic justice. I kept that business card in my wallet for 3 months before I finally worked up the courage to make the call. When I did, Special Agent Rosa Martinez turned out to be a 20-year veteran with a voice like steel and a laugh that could light up a room. She agreed to meet me for coffee near campus, and what was supposed to be a brief informational interview turned into a 3-hour conversation about duty, integrity, and the sometimes brutal cost of doing the right thing. "The work isn't glamorous," Agent Martinez explained, stirring sugar into her 3rd cup of coffee. "Most federal cases take years to build. You spend months following paper trails, analyzing financial records, building relationships with informants who may or may not be trustworthy. And at the end of it all, you might put away someone's father, someone's son, someone's family provider. But they're criminals," I said, with the absolutism of someone who'd never had to arrest someone she cared about. Agent Martinez smiled sadly. "Yes, they're criminals, but they're also human beings, with families who love them, communities that depend on them, children who don't understand why daddy isn't coming home. That doesn't excuse their crimes, but it makes the work complicated in ways you can't imagine until you're living it." She was right, of course, though I wouldn't fully understand what she meant for several more years. The application process for the DEA was exhaustive. Background checks, psychological evaluations, physical fitness tests, interviews with neighbors and professors and employers I'd had since high school. Every aspect of my life was scrutinized, including my family's business dealings. I remember sitting in a sterile conference room at the Phoenix field office, facing two stone-faced investigators who'd clearly done their homework about Martinez Construction Company. They knew about the cash transactions, the irregular payment patterns, the clients who didn't fit the normal profile of construction customers. They also knew that I'd had access to company records and had worked there during high school. "Miss Martinez," the senior investigator said, consulting his notes, "are you aware of any irregular activities at your family's business?" This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for months. I could lie, claim ignorance, and probably get away with it. The evidence was circumstantial, and my family had been careful to keep me out of the operational details. Or I could tell the truth and potentially destroy the people I'd grown up loving, despite everything. "Yes," I said quietly. "I am." The investigators exchanged glances. "Can you be more specific?" So I told them everything. The cash transactions, the suspicious clients, the accounting irregularities I'd noticed during my summers at the company. I explained how I'd discovered the money laundering operation, how I'd confronted my father, how the family dynamics had changed once they realized I knew the truth. It was the hardest conversation of my life up to that point, but also the most liberating. For years I'd been carrying the weight of what I knew, feeling complicit in crimes I hadn't committed but hadn't reported. Sitting in that conference room, finally giving voice to the truth, felt like setting down a burden I'd been carrying for too long. The investigators took detailed notes, asked follow-up questions, and made it clear that my cooperation would be kept confidential unless it became necessary for prosecution purposes. They also made it clear that my admission didn't disqualify me from federal service, as long as I'd never directly participated in any criminal activities. "Ms. Martinez," the senior investigator said as we concluded the interview, "what you've told us today demonstrates exactly the kind of integrity we look for in federal agents. The fact that you're willing to report criminal activity, even when it involves your own family, tells us everything we need to know about your character." 6 months later, I was accepted into the DEA training academy at Quantico. The day I got the acceptance letter, I drove straight to Grandpa Joe's ranch, where I found him fixing a broken gate in the back pasture. He was 78 years old then, but still strong enough to wrestle with stubborn fence posts and determined enough to refuse help with manual labor. "Grandpa," I said, climbing over the fence to reach him, "I got accepted." He looked up from his work, sweat beading on his weathered forehead. "Accepted where, Mija?" "The DEA. I'm going to be a federal agent." Grandpa Joe set down his tools and studied my face with the intensity he usually reserved for sick cattle or suspicious weather patterns. "Your parents know about this?" "Not yet." He nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. "This gonna cause problems at home?" "Probably." "You sure this is what you want to do?" I thought about that question, really thought about it. Was I sure? Was I ready to potentially alienate my family? To choose a career that might require me to investigate people I loved? Was I prepared for the isolation that would come with being the family member who'd chosen law enforcement over loyalty? "Yes," I said finally, "I'm sure." Grandpa Joe smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. "Good. Your grandmother would be proud. She always said you had steel in your spine." That evening, I drove home to tell my parents about my career plans. I'd rehearsed the conversation during the drive, trying to find ways to explain my decision that wouldn't sound like a direct attack on their choices. But when I walked into the kitchen and saw Mom cooking dinner while Dad read the newspaper, all my careful preparations evaporated. "I got accepted to the DEA training academy," I announced without preamble. The newspaper crumpled in Dad's hands. Mom dropped the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir sauce. Even David, who'd been texting friends at the kitchen table, looked up in shock. "The DEA?" Mom repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "As in drug enforcement?" "Yes." Dad stood up slowly, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Shock, anger, betrayal, and something that might have been fear. "Rebecca, do you understand what you're saying? Do you understand what this means for our family?" "I understand that it means I'll be doing work that matters," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Work that makes a difference. Work that investigates people like us," Dad said bluntly. The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke. David looked confused, glancing back and forth between our faces as if trying to decode a conversation he didn't fully understand. Mom had gone pale, her hands gripping the kitchen counter for support. "People like us?" I repeated. "What exactly do you mean by that, Dad?" "You know what I mean. Say it," I challenged him. "Say what you mean." But he wouldn't. Even then, even with the truth sitting naked between us, he couldn't bring himself to admit what the family business really was. Instead, he shook his head and walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind the kind of silence that echoes long after the words that caused it have faded. Mom tried to salvage the situation, suggesting that maybe I could reconsider, maybe explore other career options that would be less controversial for the family. David, finally catching on to the undercurrents of the conversation, asked what was really going on, why everyone seemed so upset about his sister becoming a federal agent. But the damage was done. From that night forward, I was no longer just the daughter who knew too much. I was the daughter who'd chosen sides, and I hadn't chosen theirs. The months between my acceptance and my departure for Quantico were marked by a strange, polite distance. My parents continued to provide for me financially, continued to include me in family activities, continued to tell neighbors and friends about my upcoming career, with obvious pride. But underneath the surface civility, I could feel their constant anxiety, their awareness that I was about to become someone whose professional obligations might require me to destroy them. Grandpa Joe was the only family member who seemed genuinely excited about my career choice. He'd drive over for dinner more frequently, asking detailed questions about my training schedule and the kinds of cases I hoped to work on. His enthusiasm was a counterweight to my parents' obvious discomfort, and I treasured those conversations like lifelines. "You're gonna do good work, Misha," he told me the night before I left for Virginia. We were sitting on his front porch, watching the sun set over the desert landscape that had shaped both our childhoods. "Your grandmother always said that the Martinez family needed someone with the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." "Even when it hurts the family?" I asked. Grandpa Joe was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Especially then," he said finally. "Family isn't just about blood, Rebecca. It's about the values you pass down, the example you set. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to be part of their mistakes." Those words sustained me through the grueling months of training at Quantico, through the physical challenges and academic demands and psychological pressures of becoming a federal agent. Every time I doubted my decision, every time I wondered if I was betraying the people who'd raised me, I remembered Grandpa Joe's voice telling me that love sometimes required courage, that family loyalty sometimes demanded the strength to say no. Graduation from the academy was both triumph and heartbreak. I stood on that stage in my crisp new DEA uniform, badge gleaming on my chest, surrounded by fellow agents who'd become like family over the past months of intense training. My parents had driven cross-country to attend the ceremony, bringing David and Ashley with them, but I could see the strain in their forced smiles, the way they avoided eye contact with my instructors and supervisors. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, I introduced my parents to Special Agent Chen, who would be my supervisor at the El Paso field office. Agent Chen was a 15-year veteran with a reputation for building bulletproof cases against major trafficking organizations, and he was genuinely excited to have me join his team. "You should be very proud," he told my parents, shaking Dad's hand with enthusiasm. "Rebecca finished top of her class in financial crimes analysis. We're lucky to have someone with her analytical skills and attention to detail." Dad managed a weak smile. "We're very proud," he said, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. Later, over dinner at a restaurant near the academy, the conversation was stilted and awkward. David asked basic questions about my training, Ashley made polite comments about Virginia being different from Arizona, and Mom kept steering the conversation towards safe topics like the weather and the hotel they'd chosen. But underneath it all, I could feel the weight of everything unsaid, everything we couldn't discuss in public. The drive back to Arizona the next day felt like a funeral procession. I was flying directly to El Paso to begin my new assignment, while my family would return to Scottsdale and the life I was leaving behind. At the airport, the goodbye was brief and uncomfortable, filled with the kind of promises to stay in touch that everyone knew were unlikely to be kept. Grandpa Joe had been too frail to make the trip to Virginia, but he was waiting for me when I got to El Paso. He'd driven his old pickup truck 8 hours across the desert, insisting that someone from the family needed to help me get settled in my new life. We spent my first weekend in Texas, shopping for furniture, exploring the city, and talking about everything except the obvious tension with my parents. "They'll come around," he said on Sunday evening, as we sat in my empty apartment, eating takeout Chinese food off paper plates. "It might take time, but they'll realize that what you're doing is right." I wanted to believe him, but I could already feel the distance growing. Phone calls from home became shorter and less frequent. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming. When I called to share news about my work, the conversations were polite but distant, as if I were a friendly acquaintance rather than a daughter and sister. The work itself was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more challenging than I'd imagined. El Paso was ground zero for drug trafficking between Mexico and the United States, and our field office handled cases that ranged from street-level dealers to major cartel figures. I spent my days analyzing financial records, tracing money flows, building cases that could take years to fully develop. My first major case involved a money laundering operation that used a chain of restaurants to clean drug proceeds. The similarities to my own family situation weren't lost on me, but I threw myself into the investigation with the dedication of someone who had something to prove. We traced transactions, identified patterns, built a case that ultimately resulted in 14 federal indictments and the seizure of over $12 million in assets. Agent Chen pulled me aside after the arrests were made. "Outstanding work, Martinez," he said, using the professional tone he reserved for serious conversations. "But I want to make sure you're okay. I know this case hit close to home in some ways." He was giving me an opening to talk about my family situation, but I wasn't ready for that conversation. "I'm fine," I said simply. "This is the work I signed up to do." He studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but if you ever need to talk about anything, my door's always open." The recognition from my supervisors was gratifying, but it couldn't fill the growing void where my family relationships used to be. Months passed without meaningful contact from home. When I called, conversations were brief and superficial. When I suggested visiting for holidays, there were always excuses about busy schedules or travel plans that didn't include me. The final break came during my second year with the agency. I was working on a case involving a Phoenix-based money laundering ring when Martinez Construction Company appeared in our financial analysis. It wasn't the primary target of the investigation, but the company had processed several transactions that fit the pattern we were tracking. I should have recused myself immediately. The moment I saw our family business name in the case files, I should have gone to Agent Chen and explained the conflict of interest. Instead, I spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing the evidence, trying to determine how deep my family's involvement actually went. What I found was both better and worse than I'd feared. Better because the transactions appeared to be legitimate construction payments that had been caught up in the money laundering network through indirect connections. Worse because I could see how easily our business could be drawn back into illegal activities if the right pressure were applied. I made the hardest decision of my professional life. I went to Agent Chen and laid out everything: my family's history, the current investigation, the potential conflicts. I expected to be removed from the case, possibly transferred to another field office, maybe even forced to resign from the agency. Instead, Agent Chen listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and then made a decision that would define the rest of my career. "Martinez, your insight into how these operations work could be invaluable to this investigation. Obviously, you can't be directly involved in any actions related to your family's business, but your analytical perspective on the overall case could help us understand patterns we might otherwise miss." He assigned me to a parallel investigation targeting the financial networks that connected various money laundering operations across the Southwest. It was high-level analytical work that kept me away from direct enforcement actions but allowed me to contribute to cases that ultimately dismantled several major criminal organizations. The success of those investigations led to rapid promotions and recognition within the agency. I became a specialist in financial crimes analysis, someone supervisors called when they needed to understand complex money flows or identify hidden connections between seemingly unrelated cases. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally rewarding, but it also deepened the chasm between me and my family. They knew, somehow, that I was working cases in Arizona. They knew that my success in the agency was built partly on my understanding of exactly the kind of operations they'd been involved in. The few conversations we had during this period were strained beyond repair, filled with accusations and counter-accusations that left everyone feeling hurt and defensive. The last real conversation I had with my parents was 3 years into my DEA career. I'd been promoted to senior special agent and was being considered for a supervisory position in the Dallas field office. It was a huge career opportunity, but it also meant I'd be even further from Arizona, even more removed from any possibility of repairing family relationships. I called Dad to share the news, hoping that my professional success might finally bridge the gap between us. Instead, the conversation became an argument that revealed how deeply our fundamental differences ran. "You're destroying this family, Rebecca," Dad said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Every day you work for that agency, every case you build, every criminal you put in prison, you're attacking everything we've worked for." "I'm enforcing the law," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm doing work that protects communities, that stops people from profiting off human misery." "You're naive," Dad shot back. "You think the world is black and white, good guys versus bad guys. Real life is more complicated than that. Sometimes good people have to make difficult choices to survive. And sometimes difficult choices are just crimes dressed up with better excuses." The silence that followed was final in a way that earlier arguments hadn't been. We both knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, said things that couldn't be taken back. "If you take that promotion to Dallas," Dad said finally, "don't bother coming home for Christmas. Don't bother calling. You've made your choice, and we're making ours." I took the promotion. I moved to Dallas, threw myself into supervisory responsibilities, and tried to build a life that didn't require family approval or acceptance. For several years it worked. I had colleagues who respected my work, cases that challenged my abilities, a sense of purpose that sustained me through the lonely holidays and quiet weekends. The only family member who maintained contact was Grandpa Joe. He'd call every few weeks, sharing news about the ranch, asking about my work, carefully avoiding any mention of my parents or David. Those conversations became lifelines, reminders that family didn't have to mean complicity, that love could exist even across fundamental disagreements. When Grandpa Joe was diagnosed with lung cancer, I took emergency leave and drove straight to Arizona. I hadn't been home in over 5 years, and the landscape felt both familiar and foreign. The ranch looked smaller than I remembered, more weathered, but Grandpa Joe was still himself, just frailer and more tired. We spent 2 weeks together, some of the most precious time of my life. He told me stories about my grandmother that I'd never heard, shared memories of his own father in the early days of the ranch, talked about his hopes for what would happen to the land after he was gone. "I'm leaving it to you," he said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "The ranch, the house, everything. Your parents won't understand, and David won't care. But you're the one who appreciates what this place really means." "Grandpa, I don't know if I can accept that," I said, overwhelmed by the generosity and the complications it would create. "It's going to cause problems with the family." "The family already has problems," he replied gently. "Problems that existed long before you became a federal agent, problems that will exist long after I'm gone. Don't let their issues stop you from accepting something that's rightfully yours." He died 3 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep at the ranch hospital. I was in Dallas when I got the call. in the middle of a case briefing that suddenly seemed completely unimportant. I flew to Arizona that same day, but by the time I arrived, the funeral arrangements had already been made without my input. The service was held at Sacred Heart Cemetery, the same place where I'd hidden behind trees to watch from a distance. This time, I sat in the front row, wearing my dress uniform as a tribute to the man who'd encouraged me to choose courage over comfort. My family sat on the opposite side of the small chapel, close enough to touch but separated by years of silence and resentment. After the service, during the reception at the ranch house, my father approached me for the first time in years. His hair had gone completely gray and there were lines around his eyes that I didn't remember, but his expression was as guarded as ever. "Rebecca," he said formally, as if I were a business acquaintance rather than his daughter. "Dad, I suppose you know about the will." "Grandpa Joe told me about his intentions, yes." Dad nodded, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "We're going to contest it." The old man wasn't thinking clearly at the end, and everyone knows it. "This ranch should stay in the family." "I am family," I said quietly. "Are you?" Dad asked, his voice carrying 15 years of accumulated bitterness. "Because from where I stand, you chose your job over your family a long time ago." That was the last conversation we had until today, sitting in this federal courtroom watching our private pain become public record. 15 years of silence, 15 years of choosing work over family holidays, cases over comfort, principle over peace. Now, as Judge Wells prepared to resume the hearing, I could feel the weight of all those years settling around me like dust. My family's attorney was huddled with them, clearly strategizing how to salvage a case that was falling apart in real time. The other people in the courtroom were watching with the fascination that family drama always generates. Some sympathetic, others judgmental, all of them strangers, to the complex history that had brought us to this moment. I thought about Grandpa Joe, about the conversations we'd had on his porch, about his belief that sometimes love required the courage to stand alone. I thought about Agent Chen, about the cases we'd built together, about the criminals we'd put in prison and the communities we'd protected. I thought about the badge in my briefcase, the symbol of an oath I'd taken to uphold the law regardless of personal cost. And I thought about the ranch, about the land that had shaped 4 generations of Martinez family members, about the legacy that Grandpa Joe had entrusted to me despite knowing the controversy it would create. The bailiff called the court back to order, and Judge Wells took her seat with the bearing of someone who'd heard enough family dysfunction to last several lifetimes. But she hadn't heard everything yet. The real revelation, the moment that would change everything, was still coming. I straightened my shoulders, kept my hands steady on the table in front of me, and prepared to defend not just my inheritance but my choices, my career, and my understanding of what family loyalty really meant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.